Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 8th of April of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first, we are going to start, according to my opinion, with one of the most important pieces of news that we received during the previous 24 hours. And I'm talking about the piece of news that we received from Crimea. As you can see, the Western sources map doesn't have any icons about this territory, but if we take a look at the Russian sources map, we're going to find a very interesting icon above the eastern part of Crimea. This is the icon. As you can see, this icon is located not on the west side, but on the east side, and this is very important difference. At 11 a.m. of the local time, the Russian sources start publishing the piece of information that as a result of Russian air defense work in this area, they managed to shut down some Ukrainian air object. First of all, at the beginning of that piece of news, nobody published any information about the type of object and so on. Later, some Russian sources published a piece of information that was attack of the Ukrainian missile. And this is very important because if you remember, the Ukrainians made a lot of attempts to attack Crimea with drones, and mainly all of the drones was shut down on the western part of Crimea. And they made a lot of attempts. They were attacking Sevastopol, they were attacking the bases, air bases in the western part and so on. But if we take a look at the current icon, we see that attack and that the Russians managed to shut down that missile near Feodosia, at the eastern part of Crimea. So when talking about, I will be very short. When talking about this area, that means that the Russians went to shut down the missiles not in the vicinity of Feodosia, but in the vicinity of Crimea Bridge. And this is the first part of this piece of news. The second one is that the Ukrainians were attacking this area using their own missiles. Some Russian sources are saying that the Ukrainians, for these purposes, used their own rocket that they managed to create and they started creation of that rocket somewhere at the beginning of the special military operation. So the United States of America had two options: or to provide the Ukrainians their own rockets, but in this case this is going to be like escalation of the conflict between NATO countries and the Russians, and the second option is to help the Ukrainians engineers and their science to create their own rocket. And we understand how it can be done. So the United States of America provided all the necessary information, and the Ukrainians managed to create their own rocket, and they call this rocket Thunder 2, or when talking about Russian language, this rocket has the title of Grom 2. This is the second launch of that rocket. This is a test launch. It wasn't real, it was a test, and the Ukrainians were trying to test the weapon in the real combat situation. But this is the second part of this piece of news. Some Ukrainian sources, after the Russian published information about the attack in Feodosia, started calculating the distance where the Ukrainians could attack this area. And the shortest distance from the Ukrainian territory to the Feodosia is around 260 kilometers. So the Ukrainians published a lot of photos and videos that maybe that rocket was launched from this area, and this around 260 kilometers. As you can see, the distance is significant. So as you can see, we know that before the greatest counteroffensive Ukrainian operation, we see that Ukrainians managed to create and test their long-range missile that can attack the Russians, at least according to the Ukrainian sources, in the distance with more than 250 kilometers. But this is not the most important piece of news. The Russian sources, very famous and the sources that we can trust, published the piece of news that rocket was launched not from the Kherson area but from Odessa. To be more precise, that rocket was launched somewhere from this area. And if we calculate the distance between this area and the Feodosia, we see that the distance is around 400 kilometers. So we can say that, and today there was like the first confirmation that as a result of engineering production, things that Ukrainians were doing since the beginning of special operation, the Ukrainians managed to create their own analog of Russian rocket Iskander. There were just 2 launches of that rocket, but I believe that this is some kind of media information to suppress the Russian will and to suppress the Russian spirit before the greatest offensive operation. And believe me, if the Ukrainians are able to attack using this rocket in the distance of 400 kilometers, believe me, as soon as they start their greatest counteroffensive operation, they will launch as much as possible rockets in direction of Crimea bridge with one purpose: to destroy the bridge and to cut supply and support of Crimea using the bridge from the mainland. And as we understand from now on, the second attack, the main direction of attack in direction of Melitopol, will have the main purpose to cut the ground support of this area from the mainland as well. And the Ukrainians are planning to block Sevastopol, Simferopol from Crimea from many sides, and now we understand like the shape of the upcoming plan. Now let's move to the ground and let's discuss the situation in the ground. As you can see, there are very heavy artillery duels in the Kherson area. The Russians reported about a lot of successful attacks, a lot of successful attempts from their side. As a result of their attacks, the Ukraine lost a lot of warehouses in this area, a lot of position, and they also lost up to 60 soldiers as a result of those artillery duels. Very heavy artillery duels we can find in South Zaporozhye area. Furthermore, the Russians published another video and photo confirmation. As you can see, this is the photo of their own attack, and the Russians destroy hangar where the Ukrainians were keeping their artillery systems. And the Russian sources are saying that at 5 p.m. 5:30 p.m. of the local time, they managed to destroy hangar where the Ukrainians were keeping their two HIMARS system, one M777 howitzer, and the ammo depot with shells for these artillery systems. The Russians are saying that there were a lot of explosions, and those explosions, civilians were able to see from a very big distance from that town. Furthermore, as you can see, the Russians attacked Sherbaki, the Russians attacked Yurievka, Novodanilovka. They destroyed another mortar. The Russians destroyed another howitzer in the vicinity of Gulyai-Polye. The same situation we can find in the vicinity of Ugledar, but from this purpose, we see that Ukrainians are trying to make some recon combat above the territory of Russian Federation and try to understand where exactly the Russians keep their reserves, their headquarters, and so on. From their side, from the Russian side, they're trying to suppress and to ruin Ugledar as much as possible before maybe possible another offensive operation from the Russian side. When talking about Avdiivka and Donetsk front line, there are no changes, just a regular artillery duels and so on. But the Russians are saying that as a result of clashes on Donetsk front line, the Ukrainians lost 370 soldiers and 13 armored vehicles, and mainly those losses are coming from this Avdiivka front line, because as we know, the Russians don't include the information of Bakhmut inside of this report, because this is information goes from the Wagners, and this, I believe, this is some kind of secret part of information. As you can see, now let's go to Bakhmut. As you can see, there are a lot of icons on the Russian sources map. This map is not updated, so for this purpose, let's use the Russian deployment map, and this map shows that the Russians have already established the combat line along the railroad. During the day, they managed to complete the clearing of the prison. They managed to got as close as possible to the bus station, and there are very heavy clashes in direction of railroad station. This is a very tough part of the front line, and the main reason is that there is a very wide streets. There is a wide like railroad ways that the Russians need to cross if they want to attack and enter the western part of Bakhmut. From the other side, the Russians continue developing of their bridgehead from the south, going along Tchaikovskaya Street in direction of the same central part and the main purpose in this area is to connect the south forces with the forces that are trying to attack and storm the railroad ways in this area. When talking about the north, as we can see, the Russians took a small operational pause, and we haven't received any information from this area. It doesn't mean that the Russians are not pushing there. They're pushing there, but maybe the Ukrainians, seeing that they have had a lot of problems in this area, sent more reserves just trying to slow down the Russians. Now let's turn back to the Western sources map and let's try to analyze the upcoming events in this area. We know that this weekend is the Easter weekend according to the Catholic calendar, so there were no ceasefire period. The Pope of Rome suggested to start like ceasefire period for 2 weeks, but nobody accepted that suggestions, and the Russians even didn't discuss this. But I believe that the next weekend the Russians are going to announce about the ceasefire period. I'm not sure that the Russians are able to establish control of entire Bakhmut for the upcoming week. The only thing that the Russians can do, like to try their luck and to make launch a very massive and very powerful offensive operation with one purpose: to force the Ukrainians to run away. when talking about storming and establishing control over the western part of Bakhmut as a result of clashes and storming operation, highly unlikely. It is highly unlikely that the Russians are able to do this. The only possible thing is to push, to break the Ukrainian spirit, to break the Ukrainian will to fight, and to force them to run. Do the Russians, are the Russians able to do this? Yes, they're able, and I believe that maybe before the Eastern ceasefire, the Russians will try to do this. If they're not able to do this, to force the Ukrainians to run away, and then the Ukrainians will try to create like the final defense line in this part of Bakhmut, in the western part, and from this area maybe they will start some kind of negotiation process, asking the Russian permission to evacuate from Bakhmut, and without maybe weapon and ammo. I believe that the Russians may agree for this, because as we know, there are around 10,000 soldiers in this part of Bakhmut, and I'm not sure that these forces are able to evacuate, and if they have any plan to do this. Anyway, if the Russians are not able to force the Ukrainians to retreat from Bakhmut within a week, of course, first of all, they will try to move from the southern part along the wide streets, and this is the first bridgehead that the Russians are going to establish within this week, at least to try to do this. So, as you can see, this residential area with the small buildings. Furthermore, the Russians have already established control over this part in the vicinity of the aircraft statue MiG-17, and now they're going to move to the north and to get the wide streets. First, Pushkina Street and Polvovo Street, and on the west side Tchaikovskого Street, and this is the first step. And the second step, they will continue storming area from the south along N32 road, and then they will also, maybe during the next week, they will try with another forces to get this small block that located on the north of the southern block, and on the west from the Russian forces that located on the eastern, on the central part of Bakhmut. So I believe that this is the possible progress for the Russians during the next week. I'm not sure that the Russians are able to get inside of this fortification area, because it's like a very high buildings. The Ukrainians prepared this area since the beginning, maybe of special military operation, expecting that sooner or later there are going to be very heavy clashes. About northern part, we know already that the Russians have already established a very powerful, very interesting bridgehead to the north, and of course they will try to develop this area also by taking under control, and with one purpose, to also to connect the northern forces with the forces that's currently storming the central part. So anyway, as a possible solution for the next week, is the possible results by the Eastern ceasefire is that the Ukrainians will be completely pushed inside of this western bloc with very significant big number of forces, and they will be completely over concentrated and over concentrated in this area. And I see maybe it's a complete speculation, it's my opinion from my side. I see that sooner or later, or even maybe by the beginning of the Eastern ceasefire period, the Ukrainians will start negotiation process to allow their forces to step back from this area, maybe without weapon. We'll see. So this is the situation about Bakhmut. Furthermore, today the Ukrainian sources published another video of the road that connects Khromovo and Chasov Yar, and as you can see, there are it's like a grave. It's a grave of armored vehicles. It's a grave for the Ukrainians. I tried to calculate the number of armored vehicles on this part of this road. The number is more than 20 armored vehicles. So it's a grave. It's Ukrainian Bakhmut grave. I can't call this area any other word. So the situation is very critical for the Ukrainians. But as you can see, they are not doing anything. Furthermore, as we understand that by the fall of Bakhmut, the Ukrainians are going to launch their counteroffensive operation, and everything according to timings that this greatest counteroffensive operation will be started somewhere at the end of April, the beginning of May. And if you remember, we discussed the map of the secret documents, and this piece of news is information completely correlated with the map when they were trying to analyze the quality of the ground and when is the best time to start offensive operation. When talking about the Seversk and Kupiansk and Liman front lines, there are no changes, just the heavy artillery duels, and the Russians are saying that as a result of those artillery duels, the Ukrainians lost around 130 soldiers, 8 armored vehicles and something around 4 artillery system in this area. Furthermore, the Russians managed to destroy another radar, but as you can see, without any changes on the ground. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon. Have a good day. Bye bye. Happy Easter.